Hey everybody, before I get started tonight, I wanted to give a shout out to a fan movie that's getting made it's by Wet Paint Pictures. The movie is called Voorhees. And I'm going to go ahead and read the synopsis to you here. They committed the perfect crime. They planned for every possibility, but they never planned for him. After pulling off the perfect heist, a dangerous crew of thieves flee town to the seclusion of the nearby woods. All they have to do is make it through the night so they can get away clean, but their sadistic leader has taken them to the long deserted Camp Crystal Lake, a place that is no longer on any maps, and for good reason. Unaware of the location's notorious past, the fugitives begin to explore their temporary hideout, and soon realize that this place has a very dark and violent history that they are soon about to become a part of. It is a race to morning where the lines between bad and pure evil are blurred, and the fight to survive the awakened legend of Camp Crystal Lake is much more than they bargained for. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to the trailer for this movie in the description of tonight's upload. Again, the movie is called Voorhees. It is a fan-made movie for the Friday the 13th universe, and it says it's going to be out next year. So check it out. I think you guys will enjoy. And with that said, time for tonight's video. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Today, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Dealers, Chapter 13. That's 2 of them, said Grace vehemently. She had already snipped Emma's sample nightmare disc into several sharp-edged pieces with a strong pair of shears. Now she broke her own disc into fragments. It's a beginning. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore, Emma fretted, sitting on the edge of Grace's bed with her. That guy was in my regular dreams last night. I didn't go near the TranceBox. Grace looked up at her friend. What happened? Well, I never saw him, but I knew it was him. I dreamed I was walking through the school, but I was the only one there. He kept following me through the halls. I heard him laughing, and he kept dragging his claws across the lockers, and I heard him say my name, calling to me. Grace nodded somberly. He's real, Emma. Trust me. He killed the guy who worked with Alex. Then he killed Kent, and last night, he killed Milton and Miss Trice. I know it was him, no matter what they say. They had both stayed home from school today, Grace feeling too sickened by what she had witnessed, and Emma mostly to keep her company. A short while ago, Devin had called Grace from school to tell her the horrible news. Supposedly Mrs. Trice's husband found the bodies, Devin had related at the time, but the police have taken him into custody. They think he might have come home from work and found them in bed and killed the both of them in a fit of rage. God, I can't believe this. I can't believe it, Grace had said. How did they die? They weren't shot, were they? No. I guess they got torn up pretty bad, though. And so now do they think her husband killed your brother's friend in Kent, too? Why would he do that? Or are we supposed to believe there are 2 people tearing people up in this town? I don't know what to think anymore, Grace. You do know what to think, but you're afraid to think it. You know as well as I do that Mrs. Trice's husband did not kill her or Milton. Come on, Devin, wake up. Milton was your best friend. I know that, he snapped. He had never yelled at Grace before now. We have to do something. Do what? Tell the police an undead serial killer is murdering people inside their dreams? No, not just any people. Our group, Devin. Anyone who's tried your brother's stupid nightmare software. Do you know what that means? It means I could be next, or you. Is that okay, Devin? Should we just sit around and wait for that to happen? Please, Grace. I can't even think anymore. Please stop hating me. I don't hate you. I'm worried about you, and the rest of us, too. Okay, look. I have to call my brother next and tell him about this. If he doesn't know already, that is. Are you going to be all right for now? Emma is still here with me. I'm so tired. Devin, I was too afraid to sleep last night. I only slept for an hour tops. I don't remember my dreams, but I don't think that they were good. Try to take a nap. Tell Emma to watch over you and wake you up if you start to look, I don't know, like something isn't right. I don't ever want to sleep again, Devin. Just don't use the TranceBox again, either of you. Grace had chuckled bitterly at that advice. Are you kidding? I'm never going near that thing again, and I won't let Emma do it either. But it might already be too late. I wonder if Milton and Mrs. Trice tried his copy of the disc. I wonder if they were using it last night. I don't think Krueger is confined to the program anymore, Devin. I think he's got the power back that he needed, and he can come and go in our dreams as he likes. Okay, look. I'm going to call Alex now. I'll call back in a while, okay? And try to sleep. We'll see, Grace had said, but then she had blurted, "Devin, wait. Please tell me you believe in Krueger now, please." A few moments of silence had passed. Then, "I believe, Grace." "You're not just saying that because I want you to?" "Well, you did say please." "Devin!" "No, Grace, I'm serious. I believe it now." Grace had sighed. "Thank you, Devin." And then she'd hung up. Now, as Grace and Emma sat there with the snipped pieces of the 2 nightmare discs between them, there was a rap on the bedroom door. Cracking it open a bit, Grace's father Neil stuck his head into the room. "You girls want some breakfast yet? How about you, beautiful?" He smiled at Emma. "It's almost 11 now, Dad," Grace said. "Okay, then how about some lunch?" Last night, when Grace had come home, her father had berated her for staying out so late. But when she'd broken into sobs and told him that she'd seen her friend Kent in the last seconds of his life, her father had taken her in his arms. This morning, when she told him she couldn't bring herself to go to school, he had called in sick at work himself, even though Emma was already here to keep her company. He'd explained that she might need him for moral support, and maybe even for protection. "Emma?" Grace asked, deferring to her friend. "Sure, I think I can eat now," Emma said, her grin bright in her pretty chestnut-colored face. Neil Simmons leaned into the room a little further, still holding the doorknob. "Honey, last night you told me the police questioned you a bit at your friend Kent's house?" "Yeah." "And did you tell them about those brains with the tumors that Devin's brother stole his program from?" Last night, in tearful gasps, Grace had managed to get the whole story out for her father. She'd even babbled on about the Springwood slasher, Freddy Krueger. Neil had seemed profoundly disturbed by her words, but he hadn't tried to talk her out of her convictions. Now, she was self-conscious about their discussion. Did her father think she had merely been acting hysterical at the time? "We didn't tell the police that part," she said. "But Alex says they know about the tumors on the brains. His company tried to get information on the murder victims, but apparently the police wouldn't cooperate much." "No?" Neil nodded thoughtfully, then he said, "So Alex doesn't know the history of the victims, their identities?" "No. The only real, complete memories they pulled out are dreams, from the tumors themselves." "I see. And do you still have your copy of this program?" She lifted the broken pieces and let them trickle through her fingers. "Right here." "Why'd you do that?" he asked, sounding surprised, even dismayed. "It could be dangerous, Dad. Nobody should be using this thing. Why? You weren't thinking of trying it yourself, were you? Please don't tell me you thought of that." "Well, yes, I did think of that. After all the stuff you told me last night, I thought I should look for myself." "No, Dad," Grace cried. "What's the point, so you can be targeted by Freddy Krueger too? God, Dad, don't be insane. I'm glad I broke these things before you could do something so stupid." Neil sighed heavily, gazing off into space for a moment. When he looked back at the girls, he seemed to come back to himself, and he smiled at Emma again. "Your burger doll? How do you want it, bloody or burnt?" "Somewhere in between?" "You got it." And he withdrew from the threshold, snicking the door shut after him. "Wow," Grace said, wagging her head as she regarded the shards of the 2 nightmare discs. What was he thinking? As if it mesmerized him, Neil stared at the meat, still raw and pink like striated muscle, hissing in the frying pan. He teased the gleaming spatula blade under the edge of the patty, then flipped it over. He tried not to be angry at his daughter for ruining her copy of the nightmare disc, and Emma's too. He might still be able to coax her into getting another copy from her boyfriend, Devin. So only dreams had been found like fossils in the surrounding stone of these dead brains? No intact waking memories had been extracted? Had the researchers been unable to extract such memories, he wondered? Or were the dreams from the tumors their only area of interest? Even a dream memory might give clues to the identity of that brain's owner. It frightened Neil Simmons, the idea that even a dream memory might betray important information about someone's life, about someone's death. "Victims of the Springwood slasher," Grace had said. Whereas she and her friends had only recently become aware of that moniker, Neil knew it only too well. It extracted memories from his own mind. It made Neil Simmons, who was 47, remember being 23 years old back in 1986. Those were years of terror. Parents in town had whispered of the Springwood slasher again, just as they had in the late 60s and early 70s. Somehow the Springwood slasher had returned, claiming older children this time, teenagers, but using the same horrible methods. There had been a teenage girl named Cassandra Wilcox living in Springwood then. What a name, Cassandra. She had been every bit as lovely as her name. 16, but with such a full, voluptuous figure. Her ass had jutted out in a boastful sphere like an overripe fruit. and the 23-year-old Neil Simmons would groan softly to himself whenever he saw Cassandra walk past his house on the way to or home from Springwood High School. She had lived only one street over from him. He hadn't been married to Grace's mother then. He met her the next year. No, in 1986, Neil's thoughts had been reserved for his neighbor Cassandra Wilcox, with her beautiful chestnut-colored skin. He would find excuses to be out in the yard at times she would pass, so that he could wave to her. Soon he had the best mowed lawn and the neatest trimmed hedges in all of pretty Springwood. And, with persistence, he even managed to exchange words with her on occasion. He began to greet her by name, that name like honey on his tongue, and one time as she passed, he summoned her over and gave her a flower he had snipped from the blooms he had planted in his yard to make it even prettier. She had giggled and shyly accepted it. The weather had turned unpleasant one day. Through his curtains, Neil had seen Cassandra, beautiful Cassandra, walking to school with an umbrella open against a pounding rain. He had rushed to his door, hurled it open, and called her name again. He had told her he was on his way to work and could drop her off at school if she liked. An hour later, like an angel fallen to the earth, like a flower crushed under a shoe, Cassandra Wilcox lay dead behind a little supermarket that had been shut down. It had been shut down to be replaced by a much larger version of itself closer to the highway, and Neil Simmons had sat in his warm car for a while staring at the partially dressed body through his sweeping windshield wipers. He could only pray that none of his neighbors had seen the girl enter his car. He prayed that if his fingerprints were on the body, around her crushed throat, that the rain would wash them away. Then, as he regarded the spread-eagled body, a thought came to him, and he stopped gnawing his thumb bloody. The thought that came to him was the Springwood slasher. But the Springwood slasher didn't punch his victims or strangle them when they were dazed into semi-consciousness. No, the Springwood slasher slashed his victims. That was when Neil Simmons had opened his glove box and removed the handy utility knife that he always left in there, with his flashlight and road maps. He then thumbed open the blade and slowly, mechanically got out of the car and approached the exquisite Cassandra Wilcox, as if he once more had a flower in his hand to offer her. 4 deep slices in a row. They said the slasher left on his victims. It had to be 4 deep, deep slices in a row. Cassandra Wilcox. Could one of the brains that these researchers had studied be the brain of Cassandra Wilcox, mixed in with the brains of the Springwood slasher's true victims? If so, might there be a memory locked up in the vault of that brain? The memory of a man leaning over her in the rain, his hands around her neck, his thumbs pressing on the center of her throat. The grimacing, lustful face of a man rejected, angry like a jilted lover. When people went unconscious, did they dream? And in a dying dream, might the face of 23-year-old Neil Simmons be preserved like a snapshot in a scrapbook? He wanted to see that nightmare program. He ached to know if there was anything within those dream memories, anything at all. A man mowing his lawn and waving, a man offering a flower. That might shed some light on things that were meant to remain buried. Buried. He had thought all this was buried forever. As much as he had loved her, he had hoped to never remember Cassandra Wilcox again. He had prayed for blissful amnesia. As much as he wanted to experience the nightmare disc for himself, he dreaded the idea just as strongly. He did not want to look into her eyes again, living and sparkling, or dead and glazed. He did not want to look through his own eyes again. Neil gaped at the frying meat, hypnotized by the little pops of fat sizzling on its surface, like drops of rain bursting on brown, dead flesh. Chapter 14. Bruce Simpson introduced himself to Alex as being from the Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences (BCS) division of the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences (SBE) division of the National Science Foundation (NSF). Alex noted that Mr. Simpson's initials created the acronym BS. He was tall, with immaculately cut salt and pepper hair, a perfect tan, and perfect teeth. He wasn't geeky enough to be a scientist. Rather, he looked to Alex like what a team of real scientists would piece together, Frankenstein style, in order to create the ultimate bureaucrat. Farhad excused himself to return to some project he was working on today, leaving Alex and Simpson to speak alone. The two men stood in front of the large, six-pointed, Kabbalistic symbol called the Seal of Solomon, the logo for macrocosm research, painted on one of the main laboratory's walls. Following his hand-shaking introduction, Simpson began complimenting Alex on the great work he had done thus far on the Seance project. Alex watched his supervisor walk away, uncharacteristically meek in the presence of the government man. His mind raced like a hamster in a wheel, going nowhere fast, and for several minutes he was speechless, conflicted. On the one hand, he was desperate to defend and continue the hard work he was doing for Macrocosm, and even more desperate not to jeopardize the fruits of his labor at Mnemonic. On the other hand, there was Patrick Kent, and now, he had learned during a call from Devon, Milton Ferrara, not to mention a teacher at Springwood High, that Devon's friend had apparently been involved with. The husband was in custody, but Alex knew better. He had given Milton a sample of the nightmare disc. Who next might fall victim to his curse? When Simpson paused in his effusive accolades for Macrocosm in general, and Alex in particular, Alex cut in. "Mr. Simpson, I have to tell you, I'm pretty concerned about the safety of our crew here." Yeah, Alex, I can tell you are. That's why I'm here now. We're concerned about the murder of Patrick Tremblay, too, and I wanted to offer you people our sympathy and our moral support. Mr. G walked close by the men, carrying a clipboard, but either he was trying to impress the government man by looking busy, or else he truly was too involved in his activities to glance their way. Or maybe it was something else distracting him. Alex had noticed that Mr. G's eyes were very red today, and that he'd been massaging the back of his head with a wincing expression of pain. "Sir, it isn't just Patrick's murder. I have concerns about the brain-machine interfaces. The dreams we extracted from the brain models? I'm concerned." His words trailed off, without really being sure what was going on. How could he even frame his words? "Alex," Simpson said, "I understand you've all had magnetic resonance imaging to check for the appearance of any brain tissue irregularities, correct?" "Yes, sir. Patrick was doing the scans, but we haven't done it since his death." "And there have been no irregularities, correct?" "Not yet, no, but—" Simpson smiled and put a hand on Alex's back, lowering his voice even further to a conspiratorial whisper. "Alex, see, what I really don't want to do here is spook the troops. Do you know what I mean? I know this is an emotional time, especially for you, since you're the one who discovered poor Patrick." Juliet saw him too. Yes, I know. I already spoke with her privately before you came in." "Yeah, sorry I was so late. I didn't sleep well." "Not a problem. Anyway, now I'd like to ask you what you saw. Talk with you in depth about all your concerns and answer whatever question I'm in a position to answer." Nicely phrased, thought Alex. Simpson checked his watch, then continued. "I have to catch a flight to D.C. in a few hours, but what do you say we go down the street right now, sit in that donut shop I passed driving in here, have a coffee, and chat for a little bit, huh? Out of earshot so the rest of these guys can go on about their work. I mean, this is such significant work being done here, and in the other macrocosm branches I can't stress that enough. How important you guys are. It's a delicate time, I realize that, of course I do. But anyway, let's go." A little more pressure from the hand on Alex's back. "What do you say?" Alex glanced over at Juliet, sitting in front of one of the workstations, busily typing at a keyboard. Heaps of gear were around her, and on top of one stack of equipment rested a Halo-like interface headband. On her own head, however, she wore her usual headphones, immersed in her work and her music. Julie nevertheless sensed Alex looking at her and smiled across the room at him. He smiled in return, making a mental note to bring back a cup of coffee to surprise her with. "Okay, sir. I can never refuse a coffee." Maybe Mr. G hadn't been so oblivious about the government man pulling Alex aside after all, because as soon as they had left, he approached Julie and complained. "Why is he treating Alex like some kind of star? Taking him out to coffee? And why is he talking to him away from the rest of us? Does he think we don't all talk together about everything?" With an effort of patience, displeased that he'd interrupted her in the middle of Nick Cave's ominous red right hand, Julie removed her headphones and said, "I'm sure he isn't singling Alex out for praise. He just wants his take on Patrick. Or maybe he wants to question Alex about the secret activities he seems to be up to." "What secret activities?" Julie asked innocently. "Anyway, how would he even know about something like that, unless somebody had emailed or called him to tip him off?" Mr. G seemed to squirm a little at that suggestion, and in disgust Julie realized it was probably true. Maybe Mr. G hadn't contacted this man in particular, but she bet that he had been spreading his suspicions to whomever would listen to them, both at the main office for Macrocosm Research and the NSF. She returned her attention to her computer screen in the hopes that Mr. G would take his complaints elsewhere, and she was sure he would bitch to Farhad next. But a groan from the man made her look up at him again. He leaned forward over her station, supporting himself against the desk with one hand, while the other was clamped over the back of his neck. His features were screwed into an expression of pain. "God!" he groaned. "Today is my worst headache yet." "Did you take anything for it? Maybe you should just go home." Oh, maybe I'll try to hang in there a little bit longer. He shuffled back to his own workstation and lowered himself into his seat. He then folded his arms across the edge of the desk and rested his forehead on them. Julie was torn between real sympathy and the sarcastic desire to ask him if he needed a hug, as he had recently asked her. The pep talk the visiting Mr. Simpson had given to Farhad, Mr. G, and Julie before Alex's arrival made it quite clear that the work at Macrocosm was not to fall into disarray with Patrick's death, and that instead it should be tackled with a renewed sense of commitment. Toward that end, Julie applied herself now to squeezing more memories out of one of the reconstructed brain's golf ball-sized tumors. As Alex himself had once told her, it didn't hurt to keep squeezing, even if it appeared they had gotten all the coherent memory data they could wring from the brain models. Julie had been running a fresh scan, and it had come to its end. So she took the halo down from atop the CIT unit where she had left it, and fitted it around her forehead. As she did so, she watched Farhad walk past and seat himself at yet another of the workstations. He, too, crowned his balding head with one of the cerebral interface bands. He looked over at Julie and asked, "Are you going under?" "Yeah, I just finished a new scan." Farhad called to Mr. G. "Photos, Julie and I are both interfacing now." "Mm-hmm." They heard the senior technician grunt, his head still lowered. It was their safety procedure that at least one of them should always refrain from interfacing in case there were problems, and the subjects needed to be disconnected and roused. Sometimes this one person would monitor and record his co-workers' brain activity as they were exposed to the memory extractions. But Mr. G didn't look too attentive at the moment. Julie smiled back at Farhad and assured him, "I'm fine. I'm setting the timer at just 5 minutes. If I don't get any impressions from that, then I doubt I picked up anything anyway." Farhad nodded, satisfied, and turned to his own work. Having finished programming the CIT equipment to play back the scanner's results, Julie closed her eyes and reclined as much as her chair allowed, waiting for the unit to place her in a sleep-like state before commencing its playback. The next thing she knew, her eyes were open again. It seemed she had done little more than blink. Had the 5 minutes passed already? A glance at the time on her computer screen's toolbar told her it had. She recalled experiencing only static, as if standing at the center of a raging, blinding snowstorm. Maybe there had been vague, dark shapes shifting behind that nearly solid wall of interface, and vague, distorted sounds just beyond the sizzle of white noise, but nothing more. The memory was so badly degraded that it was useless to her. She removed the headband, wrapped its wires around it, and set it aside, then began typing at her keyboard. All the gear in her station was linked into this one main keyboard, so her commands powered down the CIT unit. As she hit the last keypad, she glanced over to see that Farhad was resting back in his chair with his eyes shut, still wearing his own halo. He hadn't told her what recording, new or old, that he was accessing, or how long he would be under. A deep moan caused her to swivel in her chair to face in Mr. G's direction. He hadn't lifted his head from his crossed arms. Was he asleep or just incapacitated by his pain? She was concerned for him now, however much she disliked him personally. She must awaken Farhad and ask him to help her run an MRI scan on the senior tech to see if there had been any abnormal tissue growth since the last time Patrick had scanned all of them. Before she could rise from her chair, however, Mr. G groaned again, a drawn-out, anguished sound that gradually changed into a garble of an incomprehensible word spouted by the tech in his sleep, as if he were speaking in tongues. His body began to tremble and even jolted violently every few seconds with electrified spasms. "Oh my God," Julie said, gripping the arms of her chair in horror. "Mr. G? Photos?" As she watched, a lump rose on the back of his head, then seemed to shift to one side, like a mouse scurrying under a carpet. It shifted again in another direction, at least several inches. Then, in this location, it started to balloon. "Farhad!" Julie shrieked, paralyzed in her chair. "Farhad!" She didn't dare take her eyes off Mr. G, but she could tell that her supervisor didn't hear her. He was still too deeply interfaced with his gear. The tumor had quickly swollen to the size of an orange, a grapefruit even, and now the skin of Mr. G's head was stretched too tight to contain it. Julie heard the flesh rip, a spatter of blood speckling the tech's computer screen and paperwork. Mr. G gave one last, especially violent convulsion, then went still. But his tumor hadn't finished growing yet. Next, Julie heard the terrible cracking sound of the plates of his skull coming apart at their sutures. Free of its prison of bone, a glistening red mass squeezed up into view. Was this the tumor or Mr. G's inflamed brain? Now they seemed to be one and the same. Julie sobbed, wanting to cover her eyes, but unable to. The mass was mostly shapeless, almost gelatinous, and it oozed out of the shattered egg that Mr. G's head had become, slid out onto his shoulder, and then dropped with a heavy splat to the floor. Julie could barely make out the brain's convolutions due to its deformed state in a coating of slime-like mucus, but, with an additional nauseating shock, Julie could see that, in dislodging itself from his skull, Mr. G's brain had dragged his eyes out of their orbits and pulled them along with it. They were still tethered to the brain by their muscles, and the abducent and trochlear nerves. Then, like the eye stalks of a snail, Mr. G's eyes lifted on their connecting muscles to point at Julie. The optic nerves must still have been functioning because she could tell the thing was seeing her. Her paralysis was broken at last, and Julie launched herself out of her chair and dashed toward the sleeping Farhad, screaming inarticulately. She practically collided with her supervisor and proceeded to shake him roughly. His features looked troubled, but he did not open his eyes. Julie glanced back at the brain on the floor to witness yet another ghastly development. This time she had to fight back the bile that rose in her throat. 8 finger bones had sprouted, 4 to either side, from the misshapen, tumescent brain. They grew swiftly until they became much longer than natural digits. The fingers bent at the joints, flexing. The brain rose up from the floor like the body of a giant spider on its 8 armored legs and began scuttling at Julie, eyes wavering on their stalks. Julie jerked the halo off Farhad's head and shook him again. "Wake up! Wake up!" But her supervisor would still not arouse from his artificially induced sleep, and the mutant spider was drawing too close. Abandoning Farhad, Julie bolted. The spider-like brain scrambled in pursuit, the tips of the finger legs clicking against the floor like the nails of a dog. Julie darted between 2 workstations in order to reach the nearest door. It would lead into the adjacent smaller labs rather than take her from Macrocosm's suite into the corridor beyond. But she hoped to be able to shut the door and prevent the spider thing from pursuing her further. Behind her, the clattering sounds of its legs drew closer and closer, but she finally reached the door, turned the knob, and burst through. A moment after she had slammed the door shut again, she felt it thud as the disembodied brain hurled itself against the wood. There was no lock on the door, so Julie looked around frantically for something to barricade it with. Julie was stunned to find she was not in the little hallway from which branched the other labs. It was a long, carpeted corridor like the one outside the space Macrocosm Research rented in the vast office structure. It seemed every other light in the corridor had failed, with more ailing bulbs flickering overhead. As a result, it was impossible for her to judge the length of the corridor. In her panic, had she lost her bearings? Even if she had taken the wrong door, though, shouldn't this corridor be familiar to her? But there was no time to ponder. Julie began sprinting down the corridor, sobbing, until she came to the first of the doors that lined it. She tried the knob, locked. She flung herself at the door opposite, locked. Why should these doors be locked if the one she had shut against the brain creature could not be locked? This thought made her look back toward the door just in time to see its knob turning. A second later, the door began to open, and one eye stalk and the first of the 8 legs poked into view. Julie threw herself into motion again, almost bouncing off one wall to the other as she tried door after door. Not only were they all locked, but the more doors she tried, the more doors appeared ahead of her. How long could this corridor possibly be? It looked like a highway stretching off interminably into the night. She whipped her head around to look rearward and saw that the brain was moving less speedily. That was because it had gained in volume. The blob-like matter jerked itself along in horrible little flopping motions, like a flayed and crippled sill. The finger legs didn't seem to be growing any longer, but they hooked into the carpet and did their best to help pull the glob along. Julie continued on, breathless and lightheaded, trying more doors. Falling against one of them, she checked again on the thing's progress. It had grown even larger. Worse, she now saw that 4 crude limbs had coalesced from its bulk. These limbs dragged a roughly shaped figure along on its belly. At the end of the front limbs were those claw-like finger bones, and in the front, a rudimentary head. When it lifted, Julie could see it had formed itself around Mr. G's stolen eyes. The face, like the body, was that of a cadaver with all its flesh removed, leaving only the raw muscles beneath. But somehow she still recognized that grinning face. It was the face of the man who had been haunting her nightmares lately. He recognized her, too. "Julie!" he crooned in an inhuman voice, his vocal cords not yet fully developed. "You look like you could use a hug!" Her legs propelled her on, but they were losing their power, and her aching lungs were constricted. She didn't try any more doors. It would only slow her pace further. She kept running for the end of the corridor, but it remained lost in gloom. It must have an end, an exit at the end. It must. Behind her, with a grunt of effort, the still-forming figure managed to rise up onto its legs. It stumbled back one step, a little off balance, but the grin on its face had not faltered. Fog cloaked the floor of the forest, looking like a deep layer of snow, but overhead the leaves of the trees were an electric shade of red. The trunks of these trees were black up close, but ghostly gray as they receded into the haze, resembling an army of soldiers at attention. Beneath the swirling mist at his feet, Farhad crunched a layer of fallen leaves that he could barely even discern. He tried to make a little noise as possible, however, easing his weight into every step. He did not remember how he had come into these woods, what he might be seeking or what might be seeking him, but he knew intuitively that he was in grave danger. There were 2 swords sheathed at his waist in lacquered scabbards, his long, curved katana and the shorter wakizashi. He paused and stared down at their braided handles as if he hadn't even realized he was carrying them until that moment. A strange impulse made him reach up and touch his balding head. He fingered a top knot of hair toward the rear of his skull. From some distance off came the barest crunch of leaves. Farhad whirled toward the sound, his hand going to the katana's handle. He saw only the trunks of trees upholding the ceiling of leaves, like rows of columns vanishing into the cottony, slowly churning clouds of mist. His heart was hammering now. If he should have to protect himself against a foe, or some beast of the forest, he wasn't familiar with the proper use of a katana, however keen its blade might be. Still, it was a comfort to him that he had these weapons at all. Slowly trying to minimize the hiss of the steel through its scabbard, he unsheathed the sword and held its long handle in 2 fists, the slender blade curving out in front of him. Some warrior's instinct he hadn't known he possessed caused him to spin around just as a black-garbed man dropped down from the bow where he had been crouching. Farhad's blade whooshed through the air, cleaving the mist and sending it swirling in little eddies in its wake. He saw the flash of the other man's steel, but Farhad's blade was already hacking through the raised forearm. A greenish blood, better suited for an insect's veins, but smelling of rot, spurted from the truncated limb. Farhad spun the blade around again, and in its second stroke he neatly beheaded his enemy. In the instant before the head toppled away, he saw only a black mask with a slit for the eyes. Headless, the ninja stood there a moment longer, gushing more of that green blood out of his neck stump, before his body finally crumpled to join his head in the carpet of fog. Farhad swept the katana behind him without even turning his head, slashing open the chest of a second black-garbed ninja just as he lunged at his back. He was shocked at his own remarkable prowess. He faced this second man and found him stumbling back, clamping a hand over the deep gash in his chest. Foul green blood squirted between his fingers. This time Farhad could see his enemy more clearly. What he had thought was a short ninja sword in the man's right hand was actually a glove with one long claw attached to the index finger. Again, all he saw of the man's face through his mask was the area around the eyes. But the skin around those hateful eyes appeared to be terribly scarred. Burned, perhaps. The man made a sudden charge, whipping his steel talon at Farhad. There was a loud clang as Farhad's heavier blade bashed the ninja's claw aside. He followed through with the stroke that severed the scarred ninja's head from his neck. As before, the carcass fell away to disappear in the thick layer of mist. A third ninja came leaping out of the haze like a black panther. He too had a long razor-edged talon affixed to his glove, and he too had a face that appeared to be scarred beneath his mask. Was the scarring part of some ritual for a cult of fanatical assassins? Farhad had no time to ponder. He crouched low, the ninja's swishing blade just ticking his top knot, and with a powerful sweep cut through both of his foe's legs. The man fell into the fog, and Farhad reversed the sword in his hands to stab it straight downwards. Though he couldn't see the ninja at his feet, he felt the blade plunge deep into its chest. A fourth ninja was standing there, ready to attack when Farhad looked up. Behind the black mask came a sadistic chuckle. The man also had the burnt flesh around his eyes. It was almost as if he hadn't been killing multiple warriors, but the same man over and over. Was he a ghost, then? A demon? Perhaps a little of both? As if they had just read Farhad's thoughts, the first 3 ninjas he had killed shot up from the carpet of fog in unison. 2 were decapitated, their necks still pumping out green blood, and the third wobbled awkwardly on his leg stumps. Despite their mortal wounds, all four looked ready to attack. Farhad knew then that, even with his great swordsmanship, he could not win against his supernatural enemies. So he turned swiftly and fled, racing straight into the heart of the forest, into the heart of the mist. Let them do their best to pursue him without eyes to see or feet to run on. Still, he immediately heard the crackling of leaves underfoot as the four ninjas burst into pursuit. Farhad wove to the right, then back to the left, hoping to throw them off his trail. But it was difficult to lose them when he was making so much noise across the bed of leaves himself. Then ahead he saw something that made him halt in his tracks for a moment. A door hovered slightly off the ground, a wooden door with a brass knob. It was not set into a wall, it simply floated there in space with more of the crimson forest spreading behind it. Was this some doorway to hell that the demons had come through, or a way out of the hell he was in? The door was strangely familiar to him, though. It was featureless enough. The word macrocosm hovered in his mind the way the door hovered in the air. Yes, it was an exit. He intuitively recognized that the floating door was his way out of this world. Leaves crunching behind him, he had no time to lose. Farhad threw himself toward the door. Just a few last yards before he reached it, the door swung open and a figure appeared on the threshold. A figure posed to leap out toward him. Without breaking his stride, Farhad leveled his samurai sword at the new figure, another ninja, dressed entirely in black. Through the slit in the mask, Farhad saw dark eyes with Asian eyelids. No scars on this one. Before the fifth ninja could pounce from the doorway, he drove his sword straight into its guts. The blade all but punched through his enemy's back. He heard a cry in the voice of a woman. The blood that sprayed from the wound when he jerked his blade free was red, not green. The ninja dropped forward into the bed of fog, but managed to stay on its hands and knees. Farhad realized he had seen no sword talent on the figure's right hand. He took his left hand off the katana's handle, reaching down for the ninja's mask and tore it away. Longish black hair spilled out. Julie raised her head, her face anguished and blood trickling from one corner of her mouth. "Farhad," she rasped. "Oh no, Julie!" Farhad cried. The undead ninjas circled him like a pack of hyenas, just deep enough in the mist to remain unseen, those that still possessed heads chuckling maliciously. He sheathed his sword and took Julie under the arms, dragging her to her feet. She groaned in misery, trying to staunch the flow of her blood with both hands. Farhad pushed her toward the open doorway. Impossibly, through it, he saw a corridor stretching into gloom. "Hurry!" he said. "Go back!" "No," she whimpered. "He's in there chasing me." "You have to go back. Hurry!" She was too weak to resist. Farhad shoved Julie through the doorway and saw her collapse on her side on the corridor's carpeted floor. "Forgive me," he sobbed as he slammed the door closed. The portal disappeared immediately, swallowed up in the fog. He turned to face his opponents, then again drawing his sword from its scabbard, but with a hopeless tear spilling down his cheek. A moment later, the four ninjas came for him from four different directions, finger swords slashing through the veils of mist. Alex opened the door to the Macrocosm Research Suite, Simpson having dropped him off in front of the building before heading on to the airport, and the moment he stepped through it, Julie fell against him, so heavily that the large hazelnut coffee he had brought back with him from the coffee shop to surprise her with dropped to the floor, darkly staining the carpet. He held her away from him by her arms, his eyes dropping from the blood running out of her mouth to the greater amount of blood spreading across her midsection and the front of her pants. "Oh my God," he said. Julie dug her fingers into his arms. "Help me, Alex," she croaked. "Help me erase everything." He looked past her into the main laboratory. In just that quick glimpse, he saw smashed computer monitors, stacks of equipment toppled off their carts, empty software jewel boxes strewn on the floor, patterns of blood squiggling here and there across the carpet. She sank toward the floor, and he eased her the rest of the way down, pressing her hands over the wound in her belly. "Don't move, Julie. You must stay here. I'm going to call 911. "I already did," she whispered. When she said that, Alex realized he'd already been hearing sirens wailing in the distance. "Don't move," he warned her sternly, fighting back tears. "Don't you move." Alex looked up and dashed over to Mr. G's side. The senior tech's head was down on his arms, blood having flowed copiously out of his ears. When Alex pushed him upright, he saw that blood had also run out of the man's nose and mouth, and his eyes stared into oblivion. He left him there and hurried over to Farhad, who reclined in a chair at one of the workstations, still wearing a cerebral interface headband. "Farhead! Farhead!" he shouted. He took hold of the metal halo, but as he pulled it free, the motion caused Farhead's head to flop to one side and drop off his shoulders to the floor. The headless corpse sat there, still gripping the armrest of its chair. Its flesh was pale as wax, the neck stump all but bloodless, as if the man had done all his bleeding somewhere else, somewhere very, very far away. Alex fell back against the edge of a desk, spun away, and vomited onto the carpet. By the time the emergency vehicles pulled up outside, and by the time Alex managed to crawl over to Julie Ip, covered in her blood and his vomit, he found her lovely Asian eyes open but unseeing, as if she was wearing her headphones, entranced by some secret music only she could hear. When the paramedics and the policemen hustled into Macrocosm Research, they found Alex Carmack smashing equipment in a mad rampage. It took several men to subdue him and lock the handcuffs around his blood-smeared wrists. Okay, this has been chapters 13 and 14 of A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Dealers. I'm a little let down that Freddy only had like 2 lines tonight, but I'll get to do some more of that in the next one, I'm sure. We've only got a few chapters left in this book, about 100 pages. I'm going to be back tomorrow with more chapters from it, and then after that, on Wednesday, I'll be doing Jason X, Planet of the Beast, but I'll be back again Thursday with another installment of The Dream Dealers. So between tomorrow, Thursday, and Saturday, I think we'll knock this book out and have it finished. I'm really enjoying it so far. I hope you are too. Also, don't forget to check out the link I posted in the description. It'll take you to a trailer for a fan-made film called Voorhees, and it looks pretty sweet. If you're a Jason Voorhees fan, I think you'll enjoy it. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe. Also, click that like button. Drop me a comment. I love to hear from you guys. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropping. Spread the word out there, because as soon as we hit 500 subscribers, which we're getting ever so closer to, I will be doing a double book giveaway. 2 of these rare books that I've narrated so far, I will be giving away 2 of my copies to 1 lucky subscriber. And the giveaways will keep coming the more the channel grows. Also, look for the link in the description for our Facebook group page. Come and join us. Once we get 50 members of the Facebook group page, I'll start giving away some slasher memorabilia, DVDs, books, plushes, stuff like that, action figures. Alright, till next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!
Never sleep again.